Oh yeah, that's a good idea. For the people on stage too. Here we go. Okay, so is this one on?
Good evening.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Oh, right. I'm Hamza. That's Dawoud. If there was any question as to who's who this evening. I'd like to thank Bonnie and the whole staff here. Janice, the Janice behind the curtain. She'll come out in a second. Every organization has a Janice behind the curtain. Lark, Marissa, it's really, really great. Quite a biblical evening, so thank you for coming out. There might be a sleepover, I don't know, a night in the museum. But I thought I would begin, Dawoud, if it's okay with you, about what the audience here is not able to see, which we had the luxury of seeing in Chicago. It was actually a two-part exhibition. The Harlem USA photographs were shown at the Art Institute, which has just acquired the entire portfolio at the same time that we had our exhibition. So this exhibition essentially picks up where that body of work left off. So I thought I would start this evening just by showing just six images from Harlem USA. It's a totally random selection. And how big was the portfolio?
There were
25
photographs in the portfolio, to which I added 5, which hadn't been previously printed or exhibited. So the exhibition was 30 photographs altogether.
30, okay. So here are just a few of the photographs. And these were all taken 35 millimeter.
Yeah, these are all 35 millimeter photographs. They're from the first body of work that I completed, and they were made between 1975 and 1979 when they were first exhibited at the Studio Museum in Harlem. And this photograph in particular, I have to say something about it because it's one of the earliest photographs, and it is the photograph that I like to think that for the first time I was actually able to make a photograph that met the ambitions that I had set for my work when I began photographing in Harlem in 1975. It's one thing to have an idea about what you would like to do, another thing to have models on which to begin to build your work. But this was the first time that I actually made a photograph, and in looking at it, it did what I hoped the work would continue to do. And it was the first time that I was able to realize the thing that I was trying to do.
Right. And now, can you talk a little bit about your engagement with this gentleman? Because I think that's a real key part of what's going on, about how you've got your camera, you've been out on the street making pictures.
Yeah, basically, I started out by spending as much time in the streets of Harlem as I could, starting in 1975. I was born and raised in Queens, New York, which is, I guess you would say, it's the suburbs in relation to Harlem. And Harlem is actually where my mother and father met and had lived for a number of years before moving out to Queens, where I was born. So the work comes out of a desire to revisit that particular piece of family history, and also in relation to other photographs. But I started out just spending time in Harlem, walking the streets, trying to familiarize myself with the community, and equally as important, trying to begin to allow the people in the community to become comfortable with my presence there. And one of my strategies was to go to Harlem on a Sunday morning, to get there 10 o'clock before church services, which traditionally started at 10:45, assuming that people would be dressed a certain way at that point. This photograph was made on a Sunday morning on 132nd Street in Harlem. And I was still at an early point in my work and development as a photographer where the idea of approaching strangers made me nervous. It wasn't an inherently easy thing for me to do. And walking the streets this morning, a few yards ahead on this block, I saw this gentleman and knew that I wanted to photograph him, but he was in the company of about 3 other men with whom he was having a conversation. I was probably then somewhere between 19 and 20 years old when I started this work. So I start walking and I approach this group of men, and I'm trying to figure out how in the world am I going to do this? There are 4 people standing there. I'm only interested in photographing one of them. They're older men who I've been raised, the way I was raised, you don't interrupt the conversation of adults. Now here are 4 men having a conversation. I want to photograph one of them. How do I do this? And I thought that as I approached them, I would figure it out, but in fact, I lost my nerve. I approached the 4 men, probably said something to the effect of, "Good morning, how you doing?" and kept walking. I got to the end of the block, and that was probably the moment at which I realized that making the kinds of photographs that I wanted to make was going to require that I figure this out. Because clearly if I couldn't figure that out, I wasn't going to be able to make the work that I thought I wanted to make. So I turned around, started walking back in the same direction that I had come from. I could see that the men were still there, and I'm trying to figure out now what do. I passed them by once. Now I'm going to pass them by a second time. This is going to look kind of funny, and I'm going through this whole internal debate, should I not? But it was clear that this was the moment in which I was going to either do this or not. And if I wanted to do and be who I said I wanted to be, I was going to have to figure it out. So I walked back up to them, and trust me, it was very difficult, but I figured out my strategy was to just look at the one man that I wanted to photograph. You don't have to look at all 4, just look at the person that you're interested in. I approached him and said, "Well, I just passed you by a moment ago," which of course I obviously didn't need to say because they knew I had just passed him by a few moments ago. And so I was just wondering if I could make a photograph of you. And he said, "Sure." And at that point, I realized I had broken through the social situation. Now I had to figure out the picture-making situation. So now I have another challenge to deal with. The man has agreed to be photographed. How do I wrap some kind of interesting, coherent, dynamic form around this man? That was a completely unrelated issue. Once I had the consent, now there's the photograph, the thing that you have to make. And this is what resulted from that what was initially a very tortuous exchange for me.
I mean, I've made the argument that, being a portrait photographer, your medium is, photography is only half of the medium. The other half of the medium is people. You either have an inherent interest in engaging with people and not simply, the kind of hit and run method, which you've done, in terms of street photography. But it's interesting to me the way you develop portraiture as a distinct strand within street photography, so the street portraits and the more formal portraits. We could talk a little bit about that in a second, but here are just a couple more of the Harlem USA series, and I love this,
Yeah, and what began to happen with the Harlem photographs, continuing from that engagement with the man and realizing that there's the social situation, there's the social equation that you have to figure out, and then there's the photograph. And actually, the only thing that matters at the end of the day is the photograph. Because the photograph is going to be the thing that is the visualization of whatever the experience was.
Right.
So, in continuing the work, one of the things that I began to think about, and it was the result of a lot of things, but primarily my beginning to look more deeply at the history of photography, the histories of different kinds of pictures, to begin to think, I think, more deeply about the relationship between different kinds of cameras and different kinds of pictures that are made with different kinds of cameras.
Right.
Because that portrait of the man in the bowler is the kind of photograph that you would think. And it has all the appearance of stillness of a photograph made with a camera on a tripod. Early on, the photographs that I was very interested in, like Walker Evans, Garcia Lang, I didn't even know what kinds of cameras those pictures had been made with. So I was actually working in a very slow and deliberate way with a 35 millimeter camera that was designed to photograph quickly and unobtrusively.
Right.
And I was doing this other thing with it.
Exactly.
And that, as I moved forward, became an issue that I wanted to confront, because as I went on with the Harlem work and started making photographs that were more spontaneous, less reciprocal, less consensual, I felt that I wanted to have an even more sustained engagement with the people that I was photographing.
Right.
Which is what led me to stop photographing with the small camera, start working with the 4x5 camera mounted on a tripod, and to start making the black and white street portrait work, which became much more directed. They're staged, but they have a quality of informality because of where they're made. They are formal in their construction and informal in the space in which they take place.
Right.
But that came out of the small camera work and then wanting to make a different kind of photograph in terms of relationship and also a materially different kind of object.
Right. And I just wanted to point out that the exhibition, and it's interesting that the show begins on the note of transition. So it's the photographs, the small black and white photographs that start the exhibition are after the Harlem pictures and before the transition to the 4x5 format, right? So and some of those are really beautiful in terms of their the degrees, again, of like formality and informality, especially the ones you took at the bus stop, for example, and the way that you walked around and tried to do a kind of, how much did people know you had a camera? How much did people not know you had a camera? you know.
Yeah,
So.
it's a negotiating of a situation to make these, I guess you would say, visually poetic observations about the ever-changing and shifting environment that you're photographing in.
But that issue about, like, is the camera, to what extent does the camera disturb the situation, right? And then a street photography that's predicated on hiding the camera, right? Which is about our ability to then say, oh, it's true or it's real, right? If, as opposed to.
It's a presumably
unmediated, yeah.
situation.
Right.
And of course, there's a lot of questions about that tradition and the degree to which the introduction of the camera into any social situation, how in fact does that change in some small or large way the behavior of the person in front of the camera. Within the tradition of that genre, it's not supposed to.
Right.
It's supposed to imply a kind of spontaneity
Exactly.
observed without responding to or being aware of the fact that one is being observed.
Right, as opposed to going out in the street and having to throw a black cloth over your head with this
Yeah,
beast of a camera. Right.
I make a photograph of it.
Right.
You need to stand here because I'm going to set the tripod here. There's absolutely nothing spontaneous about the way those kinds of pictures are made. You do hope for some spontaneous gestural or psychological quirk to emerge.
Right.
You know, so there's always this aspect of the photographing rising to a certain level through the visualizing of things that you can't always anticipate completely.
Right. Right. So this image, for example, is one taken with a 4x5 format. Now, what's important to me, as an art historian, is that question about photography and postmodernism, right? An interrogation of the truth, fact, and fiction, right? But it's interesting hearing from your trajectory of street photography, right? Or starting off as street photography, street portraiture, the way that those questions are, in fact, part and parcel of what kind of tool you're using, right? And not necessarily, wholeheartedly the province of theory, let's say. Like, how do those questions arise organically from practice, right? So this is inherently going to destabilize that issue of fact and fiction, just by using this particular tool. So I'd like to let's hold postmodernism and that set of questions right here, right, in this box. I was never a good mime. And go back to the Harlem pictures for a second, because I actually want to talk a bit about you as, Kerry James Marshall frames himself as a prisoner of context, which always cracks me up. Yeah. He wanted to name his exhibition The Prisoner of Context, and we wouldn't let him when he showed us. It's like, no, Kerry, that's way too down. But I understood what he meant, meaning you are, in terms of becoming an artist, the product of a particular time and a particular place. And I'd like to talk just a little bit before going on about transitions and the different bodies of work that we have here about that particular time and particular place with the Harlem pictures. Because there's a history of photographing Harlem, right? And I'm going to fast forward really quick, just if I can. Okay, so I brought in some references just for the audience. This is one of the Dawoud's big influences, obviously. James Van Der Zee, who was featured in the Harlem on My Mind exhibition, which is a seminal moment for Dawoud. And Van Der Zee is shooting with a big...
This photograph in particular.
Yeah.
This photograph, because this whole conversation for me begins in 1969 with the exhibition Harlem on My Mind at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And the exhibition was very controversial for a number of reasons. Primarily it was controversial around the question of authorship. Who was allowed or who was being allowed to author the experience of a particular community within the confines of a mainstream institutional environment. And because there had been very little input from the Black or the Harlem community in the construction of that exhibition, there were pickets. And it was a flashpoint. It was 1969 in America. If you think about 1968, 1969, the relationship of institutional power, institutional constructs, and people's growing realization that you could speak back to institutional power, that you were almost required to speak back. It was expected that you would speak back to institutional power. So I actually went to see Harlem on my mind because of the controversy surrounding the exhibition.
You were 16.
I had gotten my
15?
first camera the year before from my godmother. I inherited it from my godfather who had passed away and didn't really have a clue what to do with the camera. I was fascinated by it as an object, as a thing that you could pick up and look at the world through it. But in terms of any other kind of context, I didn't have one. And on the day that I went to see the controversy around the exhibition, there were no picket lines. No, the action, so to speak, that I'd gone to see, I either missed it or maybe it was later in the day, or maybe everybody took the day off. I don't even know what happened, but it was quiet.
There's a great photograph of, and I wish I'd included it, of Norman Lewis. For those of you who know, Norman Lewis was probably best known African-American artist, painter.
First generation.
Yeah, but he also negotiated, a Harlem Renaissance. It's kind of like he's his narrative is quite fascinating. But there's a famous picture of him with a bullhorn picketing in front of Harlem on my mind, which I just love, of Norman Lewis of all people out there on the front lines.
Yeah, that exhibition was a real flashpoint. So I was kind of disappointed. I got there and nothing was happening, which was probably all for the good because it allowed me to go in and see the exhibition. Right. Which, if all the other stuff was going on, that might have been enough, and I might have gone home after I saw some commotion out front of the museum. Yeah. That I would have jumped in and walked up and down a few times. I mean, who knows what would have happened? But I went in and saw the exhibition, and it had a profound impact on me. The fact of these photographs of African American subjects, ordinary African American subjects on the wall of a museum, people were walking around, giving these photographs serious consideration. I mean, I spent time looking at the photographs, of which this was actually one of them. I never forgot that little boy in the foreground there. Yeah. But this is actually a Black Jewish congregation in Harlem, Rabbi Matthews, the rabbi in the back there. But I was looking at the photographs, and I was looking at people looking at the photographs. Because this is the first time I'd ever been to a museum on my own outside of the context of class field trips. So that experience and my family's history in that community began to shape the idea of what I might do or what could be done and what had been done with the camera.
Exactly, and that's why I wanted to start, at least showing just a little bit of this one. And it's funny, I also picked this one out because my cousin, Butch, is part of the Black Hebrew Nation, just in terms of us being both the product of a particular time and place. And so, all right. But just, so Vanderzee, there's another Vanderzee image, quite a well-known, iconic picture. Bruce Davidson, this is East 110th Street, which is an amazing portfolio. This body of work was shown in 1970 at the Museum of Modern Art.
It was also controversial in the African American community when it was published. Again, around the issue of authorship.
Yeah.
You know, and all of this is shaping my thinking because I didn't live in Harlem either.
Right.
My family might have been from there, but in the deepest sense, I was somewhat of an outsider to that community myself.
Right.
You know, so before even going there to make photographs, I had a sense that both making photographs could be a highly contested activity.
Mm-hmm.
I had a sense that the museum was a highly contested site.
Right, yeah.
And to come into that kind of context when you're 16 years old, that's just part of my formative thinking about all of this.
Right, but you're also at the same time aware of becoming increasingly aware. You know, between those years, 1969 and 1975, when you start Harlem USA, this is the kind of stuff that you're looking at. I mean, in terms of Harlem, had been a staple of street photography throughout the course of the 20th century, right? By a number of people. So this is Davidson, Aaron Siskin, right, who did a number of almost like sociological, like, you know, interiors, and, you know, here's an Aaron Siskin one that reminds me of your bake sale.
And by the time I started working, I was very much aware of the histories of the way in which Harlem had been visualized photographically.
Right.
This photograph by Roy de Carava. Roy de Carava, probably of all of the photographers that I began looking at, became probably the most important one for me. Roy de Carava, I first encountered his work in a book called The Street Fly Paper of Life that he had done as a collaboration with the writer Langston Hughes. And unlike, say, Van der Zee, who was a neighborhood studio photographer making work for people as they came to him to be photographed, Roy de Carava was making work out of his own set of subjective ideas and necessities to take the experience of the African American community and attach some idiosyncratic visual language to that experience. So Roy de Carava was hugely important to me for that reason. That you didn't have to be a photojournalist, you didn't have to be Gordon Parks and work on assignment for life or set up a studio. You could be an artist with a camera, working your ideas out about a particular subject through making photographs and crafting a language around that.
And I you know, and I like, you know, the fact that one, you're positioning it squarely, you know, as an artistic practice, like we're saying, like not, you know, you're not photojournalistic or not on assignment, you know. I mean, Bruce Davidson's quite interesting because when he was commissioned to do the civil rights photographs before 110th Street. But what would, in terms of distinguish Harlem USA from a history of Harlem photographs, I would argue, is not so much the subject, right? It was like tried and true, but the time, the context of the 1970s, and the fact that you were doing this post-civil rights, and also the fact that you were offered a chance to show the body of work at the Studio Museum of Harlem. So I feel like, you know, what really distinguishes it from even Roy de Carava's work, not just as a stylistic thing, or Bruce Davidson, a show at moment, was where it was shown, right?
Yeah, which was, you know, my decision to show the work initially at the Studio Museum in Harlem came directly out of the memory and the issues of Harlem on my mind, in which the photographs were made in the community, but were shown in a place that was very unlike the place in which the photograph had been made. I wanted to find a way to allow for the subjects of the photographs to also be a part of the construct of the audience for the photograph, that you could make the work in a particular place and also make the work accessible to and available to the audience and the community in which the work had been made, in a kind of self-affirming kind of way, that you didn't have to have a separation between subject and audience.
Right.
That they could in fact be conflated in some way.
Subject, audience, and photographer as a kind of like a triangulation, but also on the grounds of the institution. So I always think that the institution is critical, even, you know, at the outset when you talk about, you know, seeing stuff at the Met. It was never, you know, the museum is not benignly neutral.
I was aware of that from my very first independent visit to a museum.
Yeah.
The museum was a contested site, that the context in which the work existed mattered.
Right.
How do you take charge of that context and use that context in some conscious kind of way?
Right.
And it was because of my initial experience with Harlem on my mind that I was acutely aware of that. And even, you know, things like Gordon Parks' photo essay on the Fontanella family in Harlem, published in Life magazine. Presumably, the readers of the magazine are living a very different life than the people in the photograph.
Right.
And I began to find that something that I wanted to address in terms of where, how, and when the work was presented. Understanding that, you know, the institutional space, whether it's the printed page or a museum or any other context, is not a benign space. It's a very active and loaded site.
So when you started, I'm going to go back here, sorry for my out of order, but the Bruce Davison image with the broken glasses, I just love that picture. But to go back to here. So here, before the issue about reciprocity, in terms of what the camera allowed you. And so the Harlem pictures, there is this kind of triangulation with the subject, right? Subject as audience. And earlier, you know, you're talking about having to take somebody out of the flow, you know, interrupt somebody, a conversation, take them out of their trajectory, right, of time space, and ask them to pose for a picture, right, with the 4x5 camera. Now, you were able, because of the type of camera you were using, you were able to give them a print. And so did that kind of reciprocity, was that also a part, that's like the same thing as like the institution?
It's a part of that whole conversation.
The whole conversation, right.
How to engage the subject of the work in a more dialogical or reciprocal kind of relationship. These photographs that I started making with the 4x5 camera, I also, in addition to fundamentally changing the way in which the photographs are made by using a larger camera and placing it on a tripod, which slows everything down and requires a much more consensual relationship. I also started photographing with Polaroid Type 55 film. And what that film, which is no longer made, but what that film allowed for was the making of an instant 4x5 print, which I would give to everyone that I photographed, as well as producing an instant, very high quality negative from which I would later make exhibition prints. And all of these photographs, like I spent a few years photographing in Brooklyn, which is where this photograph is made, and those photographs were first shown at a nonprofit art center in Brooklyn.
Oh.
The Baca Downtown Center for the Arts is the name of it. So this idea still of making work in the community, and then before it goes out into the world, making it accessible to the people who are the subjects of the work. And that's something that has pretty much continued right up
Right.
to the most recent work that I'm doing.
Yeah. Now, I'd like to reopen, because this is the bigger transition or big transition away from these kinds of pictures towards the color work and the Polaroid work. And I think of that as, and this is to reopen that discussion about postmodernism. Here, operating under, I would say, the aegis of representation, the demand or a mandate for dignified images of black subjects, right? Is one, and also, but in some sense, that had, let's say, run its course through with the rhetoric of multiculturalism, I want to say over the course of the 80s, to account for the transition, right? So how did you were working in this photographic vein, and you've got the technical, you've got your reasons for the change in terms of the tool, right? Suddenly, when it seems like there's a shift from a kind of street photography to a formal studio portraiture. That was a whole other ball of wax. That required a different kind of rhetoric.
In some significant way, and the color Polaroid work came initially out of coming to a point with working in the street that first I wanted to make work that was less socially determined, to kind of unmoor the subject from the social environment, to eliminate the social environment as a part of the narrative construct for the work. To kind of set that aside for a moment, because even though they are constructed in a way that was very much against the grain of what street photography is supposed to imply. Photographing in the streets implies a certain level of authenticity. And I think the conversations that were going on that you're referring to at that moment began to allow me to both raise a different set of questions and to respond with increasing freedom while also not conforming to any conceptual or theoretical kind of orthodoxy.
Right.
And I began at that point to try to navigate for myself a space in between this notion of photography represents some unmediated truth, the truth of what was in front of the lens, and the other space which said that photograph exists to basically deconstruct the act of photography.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
That had absolutely no authenticity,
Right.
or credibility at all.
Right.
And as a matter of fact, a photograph by Sherry Levine of a Walker Evans photograph from a book is just as good as a photograph by Walker Evans. And, and there was this whole pulling apart of the authenticity. And I still felt, in spite of that discourse, that there was a yet unoccupied space in between those two poles that I wanted to figure out for myself in a more ambitious way. So I started working in the 20 by 24 Polaroid studio in 1991, right at the end of this work, wanting to continue the idea of the portrait, but wanting to challenge the notion of the single photographic image as the embodiment of the subject, that there were actually numerous possibilities, either one of which could meaningfully exemplify, a visualization of that particular person. So the first ones that I did were single portraits that were, quite frankly, based on my interest in the paintings of Rembrandt that I've had for a long time. You know, they were very informed by historical paintings. And then I started to play around with the idea of time in the still photograph. The notion that there's the moment before and the moment of engagement. And rather than making a decision about which one should be the one that exemplifies the situation, using both of them. And then continuing that idea of time in the photograph to a piece-by-piece examination of the subject that then I think is the equivalent of how we actually go about experiencing things that we look at. You can't see everything in one glance. You take it in a piece at a time, and then you construct in your mind what the thing is. So I had all of these different overlapping agendas that came to rest on a particular subject, because I thought the subjects were important too. And at that point I began doing residency-based projects, working with young people whose image within social culture, I think in some ways, has been just as essentialized as the black subject. And I wanted to address that while simultaneously working out my increasingly ambitious ideas about photographic representation, both conceptually and as an object.
Right. And now this is a point, and I like this moment. This is on the one hand, this is where I come in on the story when I became familiar with your work in the early 90s. And I brought to bear a lot of rhetoric on the work in some sense, which you've never denied in terms of the fragmented subject, right? So I always read those as, a deconstruction of, a racialized subject in the face of, a moment, that was, hyper black in terms of, we didn't lack representations of a black subject. We had tons of representations on every billboard, right? So you had to start taking it apart from within the image, right? But it's funny, in the first time you said, now wait a minute. You have your own, which is how, and that coalesced very nicely in that early 90s moment, with, Lorna Simpson's photographs, the black subjects from behind, So there was a real Carrie Mae Weems, role playing. So and these are your friends. So you were very much involved.
Yeah, and those are all they're close friends of mine. Yeah. We were talking about all of it. Right. And I was trying to figure out my place in that conversation.
Exactly. Now, but there's another thing though about, you said, I have my own way of coming to the fragmentation about the abstraction of the subject that I found interesting. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what does it mean to take somebody from we exist in space, and in different spaces from one room to the next.
To move them out of there.
And what does it mean to move them out of there, right? And to put them in a place,
what place?
What place, right? There's a no place of blue behind Stewart Hall, the blue place, right? But you thought of that as inherently abstract, and I was wondering if you could talk a bit.
Yeah, because I wanted to shift the narrative and the conversation away from this back here to up here with the subject and the material and the form through which the subject was being represented, which I thought the literal environment would shift the conversation in a way that at that time I was no longer interested in. And I was also, the multiple image work came out of my looking at and responding to and being engaged with a lot of other work that weren't even photographs. Jennifer Bartlett's The Plate work.
Yeah.
I love that work. I didn't even know why.
Wow.
But I really started paying attention to that work. Sean Scully's multiple piece paintings.
Wow.
Still love that work. So I was thinking about the form of the object, a multiplicity, and assembling something out of several parts into a single whole, wanting to have a conversation with that work, with my own subjects, in my own radicalized form.
Okay.
But it had to be rooted in the subject,
Right.
because I've always been interested in the subject, in giving the ordinary subject, whether it's the black subject or the young teenage subject, a place at the table of the historical conversation. That you would have to look at them and talk about them if you were going to look at my work. And then I was engaged with a lot of other things too in terms of the making of the work, but that was the heart of the work. And all of that work was also made in a very semi-public kind of way in a residency. I would take a space in a museum and turn it into a studio. Set up the camera there. There were young people standing around watching me make this photograph of Stuart Hall. There's a context to this work that's not even necessarily visible.
Right.
But it had everything to do with my ambitions for how and where I wanted to engage in making the work, to turn the museum from a place where work is shown to a place where work is made and then later shown.
Right.
So there are a lot of conversations to be had about this work because I had several overlapping agendas.
Yeah.
And they ended up resulting in photographs, but there are other contexts that inform how the work came into being that are equally as meaningful to me.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, and I love the room that contains both the image of Stuart Hall, and so that's where a lot of my own, who cast the theoretical shadows, I would say, over, a lot of my own concerns with the fragmented subject. But there's a beautiful anecdote about the portrait of Sol LeWitt and his wife, Carol. Yeah, and you were talking to Tim Harlem. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, because we had the photographs, I don't know, they were not near one another, but it was nice to have them both in the same room here. But if you could talk a little bit about that, how that picture came to be.
There's an interesting story to the LeWitt diptych that began with my going to see an exhibition of his at Pace downtown, probably around 95 or maybe 96. And I knew of his work, had never really paid deep attention to it, but at the same time never ignored it. There were always things that I was just willing to engage with because there was a piece of it that I was interested in. And when I went to see the LeWitt exhibition at Pace, there was a blue wall drawing, and it was just blue. But man, it wasn't just blue. And it was a kind of epiphany moment for me with his work, because I felt like I could walk into that wall and just keep going and never come back, and I would be a very happy camper just walking around up in there, like I would never need to come back. That's the experience that work had on me. Well, apparently at the same time he saw something of mine, and had a similar I need to meet him kind of experience. So I would be somewhere, a gallery or a museum, and he basically started letting everyone know, if you see Dawoud, tell him he needs to get in touch with me. I would go to a gallery, look at the show. Oh, by the way, Sol LeWitt was here. He said you need to get in touch with him. Rona Hoffman, who I was working with at the time, will you please get in touch with Sol LeWitt? He keeps calling me, telling you that you have to get in touch with him. And finally, in '97, I was doing a residency project, an exhibition at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, where Sol LeWitt, his wife, was the chairperson of the board. And on my first day going to the museum, she almost greeted me at the door and said, "You have to get in touch with my husband." And so during the time that I was working at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, Sol and Carol lived in East Hartford, Connecticut, not too far from there. So I finally went over, started talking to him. Beautiful conversation. And some of you who know his work might know that he had worked on several different projects having to do with serial photographs. Mm-hmm. And when he saw my work, he was interested in having a conversation about that because I was working with the grid. Yeah. Kind of an arrangement of photographs around the body, but still the idea of the grid. So, you want me to tell this whole
Well, he
story?
doesn't like, he didn't like me.
It came out of
no
the conversation that we had. And the first time we parted ways, he said, "I'd love to trade something with you." And I said, "Okay, fine, we'll figure it out." And I knew that what I wanted to do was to make a photograph of him. But he was, it would be putting it mildly to say that he was camera averse. He did not want an image of himself to disrupt anyone's experience of the work. So the way he dealt with it was to simply not be photographed. Which is one of the reasons there are so few photographs of
right.
him. So basically the portrait that you see came out of my getting him to sit with Carol in front of the 20 by 24 camera when I was doing a residency at the Addison Gallery of American Art. And the Addison Gallery had a number of his works in the collection. I couldn't invite him up to be photographed because he probably would have found a reason not to come. So we came up with a ruse that he needed to come and do a condition assessment of some work of his in the collection. And so he came. We figured that'll get him up here. And I had some work up in the gallery that I was working on at that time. He came in to look at the work. Again, there were grids, there were different formats of gridded portraits that I was making at the Addison at that time. Came in, looked at the work, wanted to know how they were made. And at that point, I said, well, I can show you how they're made if you just, sit down, we do a little something. And that piece, because I already saw it in my mind. I knew I wanted Carol. I knew I wanted it to go from this side to that side, and the hand or the arm would be the thing that served as a transition from one photograph to the next. So we ended up doing a trade of that piece, and he sent me one of his big, beautiful, wavy brush strokes. And he's someone whose work became increasingly important to me too, because of the way in which he found to make that work participatory. Mm-hmm. He had the idea, now here, you execute it, it's yours. Or he would have a group of students execute the work, and it was a wonderfully generous gesture. He was one of the most generous people I've ever known. But to have an idea and to let its execution be in the hands of some of you or you, to make it more participatory. Mm-hmm. Even though he is, one of the historical foundations of a certain kind of conceptual practice, by making it participatory, it just had a lot more heart for me than other kinds of conceptual work. So he's someone who I hold in fairly high regard. I know that's a long answer, and that's not even the whole thing.
But I think it's a beautiful idea of having to trick Sol LeWitt by coming up with a scheme about a condition assessment. I can't remember I met the registrar here last night, but there's one for you. But before going to questions, we didn't even get to half of what's on the.
What, the music? You want to about music?
Oh, no, we didn't even get to that stuff.
Because there's a lot of improvisation in all of this.
Oh, yeah. Oh, having seen it, having.
That comes from my background in musical improvisation.
Oh, yeah, and having.
Well, I wouldn't have the confidence, I don't think, to not know what you're going to do, but just start.
Right.
And you know what the framework, what the parameters are. You have the rectangular space, or you have 16 bars, 32 bars, whatever. You know the form.
Right.
And if you know the form, you can
pretty much move around that, and then have the subjects be the thing with which you then improvise, or the free agent.
Yeah, before I started making photographs, I was a drummer. I still play, but not professionally. And what we're talking about is this whole idea of improvisation, which all of the work that I make, I never know what it's going to be until I make it. Mm-hmm. You have the structure, you have, the rectangular space of the picture. You always have to have a structure, some parameters. But the rest of it is just this improvisational activity that you begin within that fixed space. And certainly the multiple image pieces are all about that kind of improvisation, especially because once you start, you can't stop until the whole thing is complete, as opposed to the single photograph. It's just like you start, and then you keep going, and hopefully you'll end up where you think you're going to end up. But I think the basic confidence and the rigor that I have in terms of how I think about the making of the work goes back to my early training as a musician, really.
But how about to jump to the most recent work with the pairing of sitters? It was great to hear you, and when you talk about improvisation in a way, I mean, when the shutter goes click, what you got is what you got, in some sense. And I like in a couple of the photographs, the demeanor, the contrast in the demeanors of the individuals is, knowing some of them. So the picture of Tony Herschel, and I can't think of the woman who's next to Tony Herschel, who's the director of the Smart Museum, for example, where he's such a jolly fellow, and the woman next to him has this, and it's just, but she's dressed clearly, knowing that her picture's going to be taken. But this idea of improvisation, the good, the bad, and the ugly, let's say. So there is who the people might be in terms of their spirit, and then who they are in that split second, that happens.
Who they are in response to sitting next to someone that they've only met maybe a few minutes ago. The comfort that they have with that, or the ill-at-easeness that they have with that, or whatever. Because I don't know what's going to happen when I sit these two people together within a particular space. And this idea about the space, as we talk about going back to the Polaroid and eliminating space, the space is now, again, a very important part of the narrative, because those photographs are about the narrative of the space itself and the narrative of the two individuals who I have sit next to each other, who don't know each other, and how the three of those things come together within a single piece. How I make something coherent out of that.
Out of those three elements.
Yeah, out of those three elements.
And for those of you who don't know, in the recent portraits of dual sitters, some of those were done in Hyde Park, which is where the Renaissance Society is located, and the others were done at Emory University down.
Yeah, the others, Emory University in Atlanta, and there's 2 people sitting in church pews. That one was made at Oxford College in Oxford, Georgia.
Yeah.
And that's a project that I'm still in the midst of working on. I just spent a few weeks in Tacoma, Washington, making more work for that project.
Yeah, but there are 2 individuals from the same, from a particular community who've never met before. So the space is common to the 2 individuals as the element. So,
and then I, through an elaborate process of putting out a call and finding people who are interested in participating, and then making snapshots of people when they come for initial meet and greet, where I talk about what the project is, and then taking these snapshots and kind of playing with them and imagining what might result, which is never the same because they show up looking completely different from the snapshots anyway.
Right.
You know, it's more about each of them having different narratives. Like it wouldn't be 2 professors from the University of Chicago, even if they never met, because it's partly about the narrative that each of them bring to the situation.
Right. So I think at this point we'll open it up to questions, and hopefully through the questions we can cover just a couple of the bodies of work we haven't talked about yet.
That wasn't your first time meeting Carrie May.
So the question is, can Dawoud talk about the first time he met Carrie Mae Weems?
Oh.
Carrie Mae.
The first time, is that the question, when I met Carrie Mae?
Yeah, she was a student of yours.
Well, she won't mind me telling you because she's repeated the story herself several times. I was first asked to teach in 1976. The Studio Museum in Harlem in 1976 had photography classes. They had film classes. I think I told you Judy Dash was taking a film.
Oh my God, Judy,
yes,
she was
Judy
just
Dash
in town.
was taking a photography
In
class.
Chicago.
Well, Judy Dash came to take photography class, but I think it was Danny Dawson who was teaching that. I was teaching the photography class. And on the first day of class, students started coming in, and one woman came in. She was very quiet and said, "Is this the photography class? Are you the instructor?" And I said, "Yes, I am. Who are you?" And she was quiet, looking at the ground, looking up. She had a little Leica camera in her hand, and she said, "My name is Carrie Mae Weems. Do you think I could be a photographer?" So that's where we met, 1976. She was a student in the first class that I ever taught. And the ironic thing is, until just maybe a couple of years ago, she didn't realize then that I had just started making photographs seriously myself. She thought I knew a lot more than I did, but I did a good job of playing teacher.
Was it true at the time around, did she dance for Sun Ra? Did she dance for Sun Ra? Do you know?
She was a dancer in San Francisco and California.
I think
she may have.
I think she may have danced for Sun Ra for a little while, been a dancer.
She studied dance too.
Yeah.
So
I mean, don't get started with Carrie Mae. It's like a whole caboodle of stories.
Yes, Dr. Stanford is here. I want to thank you for a very interesting discussion and presentation tonight. A little art talk and discussion. Adding to our art culture doesn't hurt anybody. And I'd like to ask the artist, on the first picture that you showed us in Harlem, with the gentleman in a tuxedo, were the other 3 that he was talking to, were they also in tuxedo or just friends that he was having a discussion with?
So were the man with the bowler, were his friends, the other three gentlemen, were they also wearing tuxedos?
No, they were not. They looked very ordinary. And see, the interesting thing with photographing that man, it was early on in my making pictures in Harlem. And I think one of the reasons that I wanted to photograph him was because he looked very much like the period of photographs that I had been looking at. So it was like, wow, there's the history right in front of me. He could have been in a Van der Zee photograph.
Yeah.
You know, that was part of it. He looked like the things and the kinds of people that I had seen in the photograph
Another era, right?
of Harlem. So I was making the photograph probably in an over deliberate way as a way of connecting to that history through the man who looked like the embodiment of that history. But the others, they were not dressed as elegantly, which is why they didn't catch my eye, which is why I didn't, they didn't look like the men that I had seen in photographs in Harlem.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting because that's really what life is getting over one barrier after the other. And you got over the barrier of not getting to know this gentleman better and being able to take a photograph of him. So
Thank you.
That was an interesting period of your life. And you're on, I'm sure now, another barrier out, as we all are. And again, thank you for the discussion and our talk.
Thanks.
Any other
So,
questions?
another question?
Can you share any anecdotes? And you were young when you got accepted into that Studio Museum show, right? How did it happen? How did it immediately change your perspective towards your art, toward art in general?
I've heard that.
You were young when you got that Studio Museum show. How did it happen, and how did that change your perspective on making art?
Well, it was an interesting experience when I had that exhibition at the Studio Museum in Harlem. One of the things that I particularly remembered, which didn't make sense to me then, but made sense to me later on, when the exhibition opened, I was standing in the gallery, and a woman came up to me and she said, "Excuse me, young man, do you know who the photographer is?" I'm like, how come she doesn't know it's me? I am the photographer, but I don't know that at the age of 24, I looked like the person who would have made the photograph of that man in the bowler hat looking like 1945. Because in making the work, I did want them to have, I didn't want them to be fixed in a very specific historical moment. I did want them to be timeless, which is why there are not a lot of cars and other things in the background. So I did want them to have that kind of, historical ambiguity, if you will. So the woman wanted to know, "Excuse me, young man, who's the person that made the photograph?" So that took me aback. But that exhibition and the response to the exhibition, the overwhelming response to that exhibition. People came to the exhibition who had never been to Studio Museum in Harlem before. That exhibition was the first time that my work was written about critically, and for the most part, in a way that was consistent with what my intentions for the work had been. So it was a very early and significant affirmation for me. And my career basically unfolded out of that exhibition. It's also one of the reasons that I have, ever since that moment, maintained a very close relationship with the Studio Museum in Harlem, because that institution is the beginning of my professional career.
But you were also, we were talking about, you know, being a prisoner of context, particular time and place. You were a CETA artist, and the CETA was the Comprehensive Employment Training Act, and they also employed art. I mean, it was one of the 1970s kind of revisiting the WPA, basically.
Yeah.
But
I was working at the Studio Museum as a CETA artist in residence. For some of you who don't know, CETA was CETA stands for the Comprehensive Employment Training Act. It was a Title VI government program that was started by President Jimmy Carter and initially directed by Ernie Green, who was the Secretary of Labor, who had very close connections to a number of people in New York, which is why New York had one of the largest CETA artist projects. 325 artists were working under CETA. And that was really also the beginning of the making of my professional community. There was everyone working in the CETA Artist Project, from Ursula von Rijdenvaart, the poet Bob Holman, Ilya Balatowski, Herman Cherry, Joseph Delaney, and a number of younger artists. MacArthur Benyon was in CETA, Willie Birch. 325 artists from New York were selected to participate in what ended up being a 2.5-year project. And a good part of the formation of my community came out of that.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. And thank you.